Now, for more on the possible impact a Trump presidency would have on the economy and U.S. manufacturing, Jack Perkowski joins me live from Beijing. He's managing partner of JFP Holdings. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Rachelle. Nice to be with you.
Now, on the campaign trail, Trump took issue with car importers threatening to levy some very punitive tariffs in some cases. What are some of the key takeaways from Trump's proposals, especially when it comes to auto manufacturers around the world?
Well, first of all, you have to recognize that the auto industry is a global industry, and assemblers are making vehicles in North America, Europe, and Asia, including China. So as a supplier to the auto industry, you have to be able to supply them in all three of those regions. So the assemblers have the ability to move production or sourcing, to different regions depending upon various factors. Obviously, they would prefer to source components and other parts, where they sell those cars. That's their preference. But when they look to source outside the region, they look at a number of factors. Import taxes certainly are one factor, but there are also others like labor costs and fuel and transportation costs. So it's kind of a complicated equation because the global auto industry is truly global and sourcing is global.
Now, as some of these companies are doing the math, you have U.S. car company Buick manufacturing some models in China. We also have Ford saying that it's going to stick with its plan to move small car production to Mexico. So how is the global auto industry reacting to Trump's proposals?
What the global auto industry, what any industry doesn't like, first of all, is uncertainty. So I would say that the biggest factor today and the biggest concern is just not knowing where things are going to shake out, because depending upon what Trump does or doesn't do, that will change how they might implement their strategy going forward. I think that once whatever policy is enacted is in fact implemented, then I think the global auto industry will adjust. But right now, I think there's just a big cloud of uncertainty that's hanging over the industry.
So given that uncertainty, you also have China, the biggest car market in the world. How do you think his potential policies will impact trade between the U.S. and China?
Well, the United States, every year or every month imports about 40 billion of goods into the United States from China, and it exports about 10 billion. So obviously, the United States is a big market for China. But China does have other markets. About 18% of China's exports are to the United States. So it's a big portion, but it's not by any means the biggest, the majority of their exports. I mean, clearly, any kind of trade tensions are going to impact the relationship between China and the United States. But there are a lot of other aspects on the table, like defense policies in South China Sea, so there are other issues out there besides trade. That's one of them, certainly.
Now, Jack, we saw that Trump's campaign promises about moving jobs back to the U.S. was clearly red meat for some of his supporters, and it was a real push for him. So should countries who rely on being part of the global supply chain be worried at this point?
Well, I think that, yes, in the absence of any other factors, that clearly would be an issue. However, what I said before is important because it's not just import duties and so forth, but it's factors like labor and energy costs. So, for example, we're working with a Chinese tire manufacturer, which is exporting to the United States, and they're actually considering setting up a plant in the U.S. because they say that their studies show that manufacturing in the U.S. can be every bit as efficient, particularly when you take into account transportation costs as manufacturing in China. So, all of these factors tend to change over time, and companies constantly, reevaluate, where they ought to be, manufacturing and sourcing products.
Now, Jack, as you mentioned, a number of factors go into the decision of where a company is going to set up shop in manufacturing. So when companies factor in all these different issues, paying for more labor, the energy involved, how do you think that could affect consumers and perhaps even competition?
Well, clearly, I mean, imports in general or any kind of trade restrictions are bad because, they tend to interrupt the normal, what would be the normal flow of goods and services. So clearly they hurt the exporting country, but they also hurt the consumer to the extent that tariffs are put on goods coming from another country for the U.S., for example, that means that the prices in the U.S. for consumers are going to be higher than they otherwise would be. So clearly that, has, the biggest impact is on the American consumer. And in general, that's why, those types of trade restrictions, tariffs, and so forth are generally not good.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us, Jack Perkowski, Managing Partner of JFP Holdings.